All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. Sorry if I sound funny. I was just coughing up a lung right before coming back on the air here. I'm looking at witnessagainsttorture.org. Well, somebody's got to do it. In this case, it's Jeremy Varon. Am I saying it right?
You're saying it right.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
All right, so hope and change and everything's better and different now because Barack Obama looks a lot different than George W. Bush, and it's all good, right, for the torture victims?
I wish that were true. President Obama came into office promising real change. On day one, he announced that Guantanamo would be closed within a year. He outlawed so-called enhanced interrogations, and then there was, great hope in the human rights and civil liberties community that the nightmare of indefinite detention, the denial of habeas corpus, and immunity for torture would come to an end. But sadly, Obama has powerfully betrayed his promise with respect to issues of detention and accountability. Guantanamo is still open, as everybody knows. There's a system for indefinite detention in the works. The administration fought to have habeas rights denied to inmates in Bagram prison in Afghanistan. And then recently, the Justice Department won an appeals court decision in a case called Mohammed versus Jefferson Data Plan, Inc., that basically said victims of U.S. torture could not sue, in this case, a private subsidiary that contracted with the CIA to render folks to secret prisons in Afghanistan and in Europe if it was determined that the trial would tread on sensitive national security issues. So the case was essentially dismissed. There will be no justice, no compensation, no admission of blame and guilt with respect to, I think it was the 5 plaintiffs who wanted some, public recognition of the harm that had been done to them, and ideally some kind of civil damages as a retribution for what they had suffered. So this really, from our standpoint, is the nail in the coffin that should really eliminate any illusion whatsoever that Obama has any intention of bringing any meaningful judicial process to sanction those who designed and executed torture policies under Bush.
Doesn't that make him guilty of obstruction of justice?
I mean, he's guilty of not enforcing domestic and international law. The United States is a signatory of the Convention Against Torture, which was ratified first in limited form under Reagan and then under Clinton. And then there's a mandate that if any signatory has a strong suspicion that the convention has been violated, they're duty-bound to investigate and, if warranted, indict and convict. So we're breaking our international treaty obligations. Domestic laws against torture were wantonly violated, but those haven't been applied. And then it's worse than what you described. The Justice Department is being used to rig the law to prevent justice from being done. So it's a sort of structural obstruction of justice where the law is essentially jiggered to become meaningless. And then in this case, the vast majority of what the plaintiffs wanted to discuss was already a matter of public record. So the notion that this is far too sensitive to discuss in a court of law is absurd. And then the dissenting judges said that in accordance with the lower court ruling, at the very least you should have some kind of panel of judges look at the evidence and determine if any of it is so sensitive it can't be discussed. And if a case can be made by non-sensitive evidence, then the case should proceed. And in this case, the plaintiffs and their attorneys, absolutely believe that on the basis of information already in the public domain, you could find on the plaintiffs behalf. So it's a very, very sad day where the massive injury of torture has been followed by the insult of not giving the victims a day in court. And it says a lot about the ideological orientation of the Obama administration. You know, most charitably, you could say they're so afraid of a right-wing backlash that they want to tread softly on these issues. But I'm starting to believe more and more that this is what they truly believe, and that the powerful go to great lengths to protect one another. And it's a kind of club from which most of us are sadly excluded. And in some weird way, Obama's first loyalty is to, his predecessor and preserving a certain conception of executive power from which he himself benefits. I don't think everything about Obama has been a betrayal, but on these issues, the conduct of the administration has been egregious, and these are the issues I care about the most, so it's quite depressing.
Well, when it comes down to it, the only remedy is impeachment, right?
I mean, that's not going to happen.
He's the chief executive, so there is no other thing to do except for the American people en masse to demand that the Congress remove him from office.
Right. I mean, again, that's a pipe dream. George Bush wasn't impeached for, a whole host of crimes. If there's any effort to impeach Obama, it's probably going to be, coming from the right. Like right now, it's not obvious what the remedy would be. Now, this case probably will be argued before the Supreme Court. There's a chance that the Supreme Court could rule in favor of the plaintiffs. Organizations, including my own, are still active in keeping the issue of torture in the public consciousness. And then, a day might come when we look back on this whole post-9/11 history and say collectively as a nation that horrible lines were crossed, extremes were pursued that never should have been pursued, that civil liberty and human rights were sacrificed to a certain conception of security, and we may have a reckoning with this the way the country has had at least a partial reckoning with slavery and the internment of the Japanese and so forth. I don't have an enormous amount of confidence that this process will happen. And then a very important moment is being lost when this is still fresh in people's memories. I can't say, at hand there's an obvious remedy to all of this. I would say that, politicians are creatures of self-interest. And then if people who had voted for Obama in 2004 would consider withholding their vote from him in the next election, that might send a powerful message. I'm prepared to do that. And I would like to think I'm not the only one. I mean, the right is sort of much better at holding the Republican Party accountable to what they consider core values than progressives are at holding Democrats to what you might consider core values.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you bring up the politics of this because it's just so obvious to me, and I don't know how anyone could escape the truth of this, that Obama's mandate was not to do a big liberal agenda like healthcare, et cetera. No offense if that's your opinion, you're for it or whatever, but I'm just saying his mandate was to undo Bush, to finally, America was saying sorry for Bush. They screwed up. They even re-elected that son of a bitch. He killed 1 million people, and they said, you know what, we're going to elect a guy with a Muslim-sounding name, a black guy, a Democrat, that's different, and we're going to tell the world we're moving toward peace and away from that, and his job, his only mandate was to come in and beat the Republicans down like they deserve to be beaten down. And if you can't win, if Barack Obama, Mr. Orator, can't win an argument about Guantanamo Bay or win an argument about why Islam attacked us that day or whatever madness these Republicans have to resort to, then he is a pathetic loser and should be thrown in the garbage can. How could anyone lose an argument against a Republican? He should have been doing nothing but prosecute them and destroy them. And I don't mean Karl Rove-type political prosecutions. I mean for torturing people to death, for lying people into an aggressive war, for throwing men's lives away for lies and